So in addition to developing a romantic relationship and continuing to develop friendships, it is also during this early adulthood period, remember from ages 18 to 40-ish, where people start to develop the family life cycle. So, early adulthood, as all of you are very well aware, usually consists of leaving home, joining families in marriage, and then eventually, for most people, going on to have kids of their own. Middle adulthood and late adulthood, we'll obviously talk about more later. Middle adulthood, you're launching your children, getting them ready for college, sending them off, whereas late adulthood is marked by retirement, aging, and sometimes death of spouse. Stress is greatest during transitions between these phases, so going from leaving home, transitioning into parenthood, transitioning into launching children. All those transitory phases tend to be the highest stress periods for people in adulthood. Some aspects of this cycle have been changing over time with different generations. So one of these is the age of leaving the home and also sort of patterns of returning back to home. So that has increased over the last 60 years, mostly due to financial difficulties. So it can be really difficult for people now to find jobs after they've graduated from high school or after they've graduated from college. And so if they can't find a high-paying job and cannot afford housing, then it's sometimes a good option to move back in with the parents. In addition to that, sometimes parents may be having financial difficulties and can benefit from having a child in the house that has some sort of income coming in, and so combining incomes from college graduated children and their parents can sometimes just be the solution to some really difficult financial problems. About 50% of 18 to 25-year-olds will return home after they've left. So if they've gone off to college, oftentimes a lot of people will go back home for brief periods of time. That's typically true during those transitory periods. So if someone goes to college, they graduate, but they can't quite find a job or settle into a career, then it's during that transition period that they're pretty likely to go back home and live with their parents. In addition to income, people may move back home due to health issues, mental health issues, things like that. They may have a job but still not be able to afford housing. And they may also just have a desire to conserve resources. So even if you have a job and you could technically afford a house, you may make the decision, I want to move in with my parents so that I can start saving money or paying off student loans, things like that. Culture, social economic status, and ethnicity all affect the ability and interest to leave. So African American and Hispanic families, for example, African American and Hispanic young adults tend to stay at home longer or return more frequently than Caucasians. Part of that is due to differences in socioeconomic status, but also part of it is a cultural thing. So African American and Hispanic families tend to place more emphasis on an extended family and tend to be more open to their children staying at home than Caucasian families do in general. Parents tend to be highly committed to helping young people move into adult roles, so they tend to provide financial support, emotional support, advice, pretty much anything they can to help their children transition. Leaving home very early is often linked to disadvantages. If someone leaves the house at 18 but isn't going to college, then oftentimes they're more likely to move back into their parents' house or to have difficulties adjusting. Someone who leaves before 18 often is going to have pretty huge disadvantages compared to someone who waits a little later to move out. So after leaving home and going to college, often one of the next steps in this life cycle is to get married. And just like with leaving the home, there have been some changes in some of the trends in marriage over the past few decades. So people in general are marrying later. Part of that is due to changing roles of women, which I'm pretty sure we've discussed multiple times in this class. So as women have more opportunities for education and to develop their careers, they tend to put off marrying to a later date. In addition to that, though, people now are more likely to cohabitate, so to be in a committed, intimate relationship, be living together, but not actually be married. 70% of people will marry at least once within their lifetime in the current generation. There are fewer marriages overall, so more people are choosing to stay single. Like I said, there's more people cohabiting. And then a lot of people will also choose not to remarry after they've gone through a divorce. And so because of that, the overall number of marriages now is lower than it used to be. There's lots of reasons to get married. Obviously, you know, there's the intimate connection you share with someone. You want to display that. You want to make that commitment. So it's valued for its public legitimacy, show of commitment, but also the financial and legal benefits that come from being married. So you have, you know, like tax benefits, and it's better for, you know, if something were to happen to you, you pass away, it's easier to pass on, you know, your possessions, things like that. Another trend in marriage is that there have been pretty large gains in legalization, recognition of same-sex marriages. So there are now 20 countries that recognize same-sex marriages, whereas, you know, even a decade or so ago that number was close to 0. So there's been pretty huge gains in that direction as well. So once someone gets married, then it can be very difficult to sort of adjust to the different roles that you have to take on. So like I said, you know, throughout adolescence, you're kind of developing your identity, but then you kind of have to change up your identity again a lot of times once you are in a committed relationship. And part of that identity is trying to divide up the different roles of the spouses. Traditional marriage has a really clear division of roles where women are mostly involved in the housework, raising the children, sort of taking care of the husband basically, whereas the man is considered the head of the household. He's making an income and providing economic support. That's kind of the traditional view of marriage. Egalitarian marriage is where the partners are viewed as equal, so they share responsibility for house chores, they balance their attention to jobs, children, etc. Most well-educated women expect this form of marriage rather than a traditional marriage. It's been shown that that views of egalitarian marriage are becoming more and more acceptable, and people have attitudes that marriages should be more egalitarian than traditional. However, those attitudes associated with like women doing less housework haven't necessarily been compensated by men actually doing more housework. So this graph is basically showing there's a bunch of different countries listed here, and they're going from less to more egalitarian. So the ones up here, Norway and France, would be like the most egalitarian cultures. It's really common in those cultures for people to have a more egalitarian marriage, where countries like Slovenia are less egalitarian. And then it's showing the hours of household work per week. The red bar is men and the yellow bar is women. And basically what you can see is that in the more egalitarian countries, or the more egalitarian a country is, the less hours of work a woman is doing, but you don't necessarily see an increase in the number of hours of work that men are doing. And so in other words, women are doing less housework, but it's not necessarily the case that men are like compensating by doing more housework. There's actually some research that shows that a lot of times what happens in an egalitarian marriage, the woman gives up some of the housework, and then it's either paid, so you pay a maid or someone to do the housework for you, or basically people just kind of lower their standards of how clean their house should be. Women are more tolerant putting up with an unkempt house, and so the housework basically just doesn't get done. So the point is, attitudes may be changing, but it doesn't necessarily seem like the behavior is following from those attitude shifts. So transitioning to married life, I already talked about some of those marital roles. Figuring all that out with your spouse can be very difficult. That's where that constructive problem solving helps. If you can directly talk about what you expect from your partner and you can sort of work that out explicitly, that's much better than just kind of expecting the other person to read your mind or know what you expect from them and getting mad at them when they don't do it. So deciding those new joint daily routines, family traditions, rituals, etc. can be really difficult. That can be more difficult if you are in a couple with a mixed race or mixed background, just because you're going to have different views culturally about what to expect from a marriage. You're going to have different traditions, and so trying to figure all that out and fit together can sometimes be difficult. More couples are living together beforehand. Like I said, cohabiting is becoming more common, and so because of that, the transition to married life isn't maybe as impactful as it used to be, right? It used to be you're pretty much living on your own until the day you get married, and now all of a sudden you're living together, whereas now, because people cohabitate before they even get married, marriage isn't necessarily this like huge transition that you're going through because you were already living with the person. Age at the time of marriage is one of the most consistent predictors of marital stability. So typically people who get married in their teens or early 20s are more likely to get divorced than those who wait until like their late 20s or 30s to get married. This is just a list of all the factors related to marital satisfaction. A lot of these are probably pretty obvious. So the backgrounds of the people in the marriage, whether they're similar or not, their financial backgrounds, things like that. Age at time of marriage, I just talked about. Similarly, timing of first pregnancy. Typically, people who wait until a year after they've gotten married to have their first child are more likely to have a successful relationship compared to people who have their first pregnancy earlier. Relationship to the extended family and also marital patterns within the extended family. So obviously if you get along well with your in-laws, then you're probably going to have a more successful relationship in marriage compared to if you're constantly fighting with your in-laws. If there are lots of divorces within the extended family, then that's been shown to correlate with higher rates of divorce. Of course, financial and employment status, family responsibilities, etc. Personality characteristics and behavior. Obviously, if you're in a relationship with someone who has a poor personality and poor behaviors, it's going to be hard. Positive biases of partners' attributes. So if you tend to view them in a positive light, then of course it's going to result in a more successful relationship. So I think probably most of these are pretty obvious.